Ladies and gentlemen, hear me and hear me well. The greatest enemy of progress is not always the devil. It is a murmuring heart. You cannot walk in victory if your mouth is full of complaints. Life may have thrown stones at you, people may have misunderstood you, and doors may have been shut against you. But I came to announce to you today, God is still faithful. Complaining magnifies problems, thanksgiving magnifies God. When a person complains, they take their focus away from God and place it entirely on what is not working, what is missing, or what seems delayed. Complaints enlarge the problem in the mind, making it look bigger than it truly is. The more one talks about how bad things are, the more the situation appears impossible. Complaining feeds discouragement, and discouragement weakens faith. A weak faith cannot sustain expectation, and without expectation, there is no room for miracles. Complaining blinds the eyes to possibilities and magnifies the mountain instead of the God who can move the mountain. It exaggerates the size of pain and reduces the awareness of divine power. Thanksgiving, on the other hand, magnifies God. Thanksgiving shifts focus from the weight of the challenge to the greatness of God. It is not that God becomes bigger when we thank him, but our perception of his greatness expands. Thanksgiving reminds the heart that God is faithful, powerful, and able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think. It invites the presence of God into situations, and his presence changes everything. When Paul and Silas were in prison, they could have chosen to complain about injustice and pain. Instead, they sang praises, and their thanksgiving invited the supernatural into their cell. The prison shook, doors opened, and chains fell off. Their gratitude magnified God above their bondage, and God responded with deliverance. Complaining creates an atmosphere where bitterness, frustration, and unbelief thrive. It limits spiritual sensitivity and opens the door for doubt. It causes one to rehearse negativity, speaking words that align with defeat. The Israelites in the wilderness complained repeatedly, and their complaints kept them wandering for 40 years. They saw giants larger than life because complaining magnified their enemies, and as a result, they missed the promise that was already theirs. A complaining spirit makes blessings look small and problems look insurmountable. It reduces gratitude for what is present and highlights only what is absent. Thanksgiving creates an atmosphere where faith, joy, and hope thrive. It opens the eyes to see even the smallest blessings as tokens of God's love. Gratitude transforms perspective, helping one to see God's hand even in difficult seasons. When Jesus faced the challenge of feeding 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he did not complain about scarcity. He lifted the bread and gave thanks. In that moment of thanksgiving, the bread multiplied and thousands were fed. Thanksgiving magnified God's provision above the visible lack. The act of gratitude shifted the atmosphere and made room for a miracle. Complaining drains strength. Thanksgiving releases strength. A person who complains feels weaker because their words reinforce despair. But a person who gives thanks draws joy from God's presence, and the joy of the Lord becomes their strength. Complaining magnifies fear. Thanksgiving magnifies faith. Complaining says the situation is too hard. Thanksgiving says with God all things are possible. Complaining builds walls. Thanksgiving builds bridges. Complaining closes the door to solutions. Thanksgiving opens the door to divine surprises. Complaining is the language of the flesh. Thanksgiving is the language of the spirit. Complaining is rooted in sight. Thanksgiving is rooted in faith. Complaining rehearses the size of the problem. Thanksgiving rehearses the size of God. Complaining draws heaviness. Thanksgiving draws light. Complaining magnifies impossibility. Thanksgiving magnifies possibility. Complaining focuses on what the enemy is doing. Thanksgiving focuses on what God is able to do. God does not respond to complaints, he responds to faith. Complaints are expressions of dissatisfaction rooted in frustration, fear, and unbelief. When people complain, they are essentially declaring that God is either unwilling or unable to change their situation. Complaining places the problem above the promise and magnifies impossibility instead of God's faithfulness. It is the language of doubt, and doubt cannot move God. Complaining may attract the sympathy of men, but it does not attract the intervention of heaven. God is moved by faith, not by murmuring. The children of Israel illustrate this truth clearly. Despite seeing miracles in Egypt and at the Red Sea, their continuous complaints about food, water, and challenges angered God and delayed their journey to the promised land. They grumbled instead of trusting, and instead of miracles, they received judgment. Their voices were filled with complaints, but God was waiting for voices filled with faith. Faith, on the other hand, is the language that God responds to. Faith declares that God is true, even when circumstances seem false. Faith chooses to trust God's character and promises in the midst of contradictions. When blind Bartimaeus cried out to Jesus, he was not complaining about his blindness. He was expressing faith that Jesus could heal him. His persistence and belief drew the attention of Jesus, and he received his sight. The woman with the issue of blood did not complain about 12 years of pain and rejection. She acted in faith, saying within herself, "If I may but touch the hem of his garment, I shall be made whole." Her faith pulled virtue from Jesus and brought instant healing. God responds to that kind of posture. Complaining is the sound of despair, but faith is the sound of expectation. Where there is faith, there is hope. Where there is hope, miracles can be birthed. Faith is not denial of reality, but it is choosing to exalt God's word above present reality. Complaints deny God's power, but faith magnifies his ability. When people complain, they remind God of how big the problem is. When they operate in faith, they remind the problem of how big God is. Complaints also quench gratitude. A heart that complains rarely remembers past victories. The Israelites quickly forgot the Red Sea miracle the moment they faced hunger. Instead of thanking God for deliverance, they accused him of bringing them out to die. That posture never moves God to act. Faith, however, remembers past testimonies and uses them as fuel for present trust. David stood before Goliath, not with complaints about how unfair the battle was, but with faith anchored on God's past help against the lion and the bear. His faith moved God and released supernatural backing to bring down a giant with just a stone. Faith is the currency of heaven. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because he that comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. Complaints displease him because they contradict his nature and promises, but faith delights him because it proves trust in his integrity. Complaints shut doors, faith opens them. Complaints keep people stagnant, faith moves them forward. Complaints amplify the voice of the enemy, faith amplifies the voice of God. God responds to faith because faith aligns with his will. Faith is not passive wishing, it is active confidence in his word. Complaining makes God look unfaithful, but faith declares him faithful even before results manifest. Complaining limits expectation, faith enlarges expectation. Complaining focuses on what is missing, faith focuses on what is coming. Complaining stirs fear, faith stirs courage. Complaining questions God's goodness, faith proclaims God's goodness. Your posture determines your breakthrough. Posture here does not only mean physical stance, but the attitude of the heart, the position of the mind, and the alignment of words and actions with faith. A person's posture in the face of trials can either attract divine intervention or prolong delay. The way one reacts under pressure reveals whether they believe in God's ability to deliver or whether they are consumed by fear. When the heart is positioned in trust and thanksgiving, breakthrough is inevitable. But when it is filled with complaints, doubt, and negativity, even blessings can be delayed. The posture of faith always provokes God's attention. When Hannah was barren, her posture shifted from sorrowful complaints to pouring out her heart in prayer. Her new posture before God brought the prophetic word from Eli and opened her womb to birth Samuel. It was not simply her desire that moved God, but the heart posture with which she presented it. The posture of humility also attracts breakthroughs. The Syrophoenician woman came to Jesus for her daughter's healing. Though initially rejected, her humble persistence and posture of reverence moved Jesus to do what he had not planned for that moment, granting healing to her child. Your posture in worship determines your breakthrough. Paul and Silas had every reason to be discouraged in prison. Their bodies were in chains, their backs bleeding, and their future uncertain. But instead of complaining, their posture was one of praise and worship. They sang at midnight, and heaven responded with an earthquake that broke their chains and opened the prison doors. Their posture of worship unlocked a breakthrough that no human key could have provided. Posture is also about expectation. The woman with the issue of blood positioned herself with determination. She said within herself, "If I may but touch his garment, I shall be made whole." Her posture was not passive but active, pressing through the crowd until she reached Jesus. That posture released her healing instantly. On the other hand, the Israelites at the border of the promised land had a posture of fear. When they heard about giants in the land, they saw themselves as grasshoppers, and that posture kept them from entering into their breakthrough. Posture of obedience is another dimension. When Naaman the leper came to Elisha, he expected a dramatic display, but the prophet told him to dip 7 times in the Jordan. At first, his posture was prideful and resistant, and as long as he held that posture, the leprosy remained. The moment he humbled himself to obey, the breakthrough of healing came. Breakthroughs are tied to obedience, and obedience is revealed through posture. Posture of gratitude also determines breakthrough. Jesus stood before the tomb of Lazarus and lifted his eyes in thanksgiving before calling him forth. His posture was one of confidence in God's power, not panic or doubt. That thanksgiving posture released resurrection life. Similarly, when faced with scarcity of bread and fish, his posture was gratitude, and multiplication followed. Gratitude magnifies God and creates a spiritual climate for miracles. Posture is a reflection of alignment. A wrong posture delays destiny, while a right posture accelerates it. Attitude in waiting seasons matters as much as prayer. Many remain in cycles of delay because their posture is bitterness, envy, or constant complaints. Others advance quickly because their posture is joy, patience, and unwavering trust. The condition of the heart determines whether the door opens or remains closed. Thanksgiving attracts divine surprises. Thanksgiving is more than a polite response to blessings received. It is a spiritual key that unlocks realms of favor and divine intervention. A thankful heart is a magnet for God's presence, and where his presence is, extraordinary things happen. Thanksgiving shifts the atmosphere from ordinary to supernatural. It is not only a reaction after something good has happened, but also an act of faith that provokes heaven to respond with unexpected blessings. Thanksgiving is a declaration that God is faithful even before results are visible. It says, "Lord, I trust your character more than my circumstance." This posture stirs divine intervention because God delights in those who honor him with gratitude. When the Israelites grumbled in the wilderness, they limited what God wanted to do for them. But whenever they lifted songs of praise, his presence manifested in mighty ways. Gratitude opens doors that complaints can never open. The example of Jesus feeding the 5,000 demonstrates this truth. When faced with a crowd and only 5 loaves and 2 fishes, the natural reaction would have been worry. Instead, Jesus lifted the little in his hands and gave thanks. The moment thanksgiving ascended, multiplication was released, and the little became more than enough. Thanksgiving attracted a divine surprise that fed thousands. Without gratitude, the bread would have remained ordinary, but with thanksgiving, it became supernatural provision. Paul and Silas also revealed the power of thanksgiving. Imprisoned unjustly, they chose to sing hymns at midnight. Their songs of praise were acts of thanksgiving in the midst of pain. As their voices rose, heaven responded with an earthquake that shook the prison to its foundations. Chains fell off, doors opened, and their situation turned around instantly. They did not pray for escape. Their thanksgiving attracted a divine surprise greater than they could have planned. Thanksgiving carries the power of multiplication. When you thank God for what seems small, he increases it. When you thank him for life, strength, and daily bread, he adds more. Gratitude communicates trust, and trust attracts more blessings. Complaints repel favor, but thanksgiving multiplies favor. Divine surprises often come in the place of a thankful heart, because gratitude prepares the vessel to receive more. Thanksgiving is also a weapon in spiritual warfare. The enemy thrives on fear, bitterness, and complaints. When a believer chooses thanksgiving instead, the enemy is silenced. Jehoshaphat demonstrated this when he appointed singers to praise God ahead of the army. As they gave thanks, saying, "For the Lord is good and his mercy endures forever." God set ambushes against their enemies. They experienced victory without fighting, and the spoil of the battle was more than they could carry. Their thanksgiving attracted a surprise victory that strategy alone could not achieve. Thanksgiving is an expression of humility. It acknowledges that every good and perfect gift comes from above. This humility attracts grace, and grace always manifests in surprising ways. A thankful heart says, "I could not have achieved this on my own. Lord, it is your doing." Such a heart never lacks divine visitation. Thanksgiving builds expectation, and expectation sets the stage for God to do beyond what the mind imagines. Thanksgiving changes the atmosphere within a person. A heart full of gratitude is light, hopeful, and joyful. That atmosphere draws divine intervention because God dwells in the praises of his people. Where he dwells, miracles happen suddenly. Divine surprises often come in moments when gratitude has saturated the environment, making it conducive for heaven to invade earth. Gratitude is proof of trust in God's faithfulness. When a person chooses to be grateful, it is a visible demonstration that they believe God has been good in the past, he is present in the now, and he will be faithful in the future. Gratitude shows that the heart is anchored in confidence rather than fear or doubt. It is easy to thank God when everything looks perfect, but true gratitude shines brightest in seasons of uncertainty. A thankful believer is essentially declaring, "Lord, even though I may not see the full picture, I trust that you are working all things for my good." A gratitude functions as an outward sign of inward faith. Words of thanksgiving are not merely courtesy, but testimonies of reliance on God's integrity. To be grateful is to confess that God's track record is reliable. In the wilderness, the Israelites often forgot God's past miracles and replaced gratitude with murmuring. Their lack of thanksgiving was evidence of their lack of trust in his faithfulness. On the other hand, David consistently expressed gratitude, recounting God's victories over the lion and the bear as proof that he would also deliver him from Goliath. His gratitude reflected a heart anchored in trust. Gratitude proves trust because it is not based on immediate circumstances but on unchanging truths about God. Circumstances shift, people disappoint, and seasons change, but gratitude flows from the conviction that God never fails. When Job lost everything, his decision to bow in worship and say, "The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord," was a statement of trust. His gratitude was not denial of pain, but a declaration of God's faithfulness even in loss. Gratitude in such moments is undeniable evidence that one's confidence is not in outcomes, but in God Himself. Trusting God's faithfulness means remembering His past interventions, and gratitude is the bridge that keeps memory alive. When a believer gives thanks for yesterday's provision, they declare trust that the God who supplied then will also supply today. When Jesus stood before the tomb of Lazarus, He lifted His eyes and thanked the Father before the miracle happened. His gratitude was proof of absolute trust in God's faithfulness to hear Him. That trust opened the door for resurrection power to manifest. Gratitude precedes manifestation because it testifies that the heart is already confident in God's ability. Gratitude also proves trust in waiting seasons. Many people complain when promises are delayed, but gratitude says, "I believe you are too faithful to fail." Paul wrote from prison, urging believers to rejoice always and in everything give thanks. His gratitude, even behind bars, showed unshakable trust in God's faithfulness. He did not see chains as evidence of abandonment, but as opportunities for God's glory to be revealed. Such gratitude becomes a testimony that faith is intact despite unfavorable conditions. Gratitude keeps the heart aligned with God's faithfulness, while complaints distort perception. Complaining magnifies the problem and makes God seem small, but gratitude magnifies God and reduces the weight of the problem. Gratitude says, "God is bigger than this." Gratitude is a response of trust because it acknowledges that God's plan is greater than present discomfort. It says, "I may not understand, but I trust you." Gratitude is not passive, it actively invites God into situations. A grateful heart becomes a dwelling place for His presence, and His presence guarantees faithfulness. The psalmist declared, "Enter His gates with thanksgiving and His courts with praise." Gratitude is the access code that acknowledges God's reliability and welcomes Him to act again. A life marked by gratitude becomes living proof that God's faithfulness is trusted, honored, and celebrated at all times. Miracles are born in the womb of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving creates the spiritual environment where the supernatural can manifest. It is more than a polite response after receiving a blessing. It is a seed that births results far beyond human effort. When a person chooses to give thanks, they are inviting God to breathe upon their situation and release outcomes that cannot be explained by natural means. Complaints choke faith, but gratitude fertilizes faith until it produces miracles. Thanksgiving turns little into abundance. When Jesus faced the crowd of over 5,000 people with only 5 loaves and 2 fishes, the natural reaction would have been frustration or anxiety. Instead, He lifted the loaves, gave thanks, and released them. The act of thanksgiving transformed insufficiency into more than enough. Multiplication happened not when the bread was held, but when it was thanked for. Gratitude birthed a miracle of supernatural provision. Without thanksgiving, the 5 loaves would have remained small, but thanksgiving made them the instrument of an unforgettable miracle. Thanksgiving releases resurrection power. At the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus gave thanks before calling him out of the grave. He did not complain about the delay or the impossibility of the situation. Gratitude became the womb that birthed the miracle of resurrection. Thanksgiving demonstrated absolute trust in the Father's faithfulness and activated divine power over death. Lazarus walked out alive because thanksgiving had already prepared the atmosphere for the miraculous. Thanksgiving shifts the atmosphere in times of bondage and adversity. Paul and Silas, imprisoned and chained at midnight, chose to sing praises instead of groaning in pain. Their thanksgiving provoked an earthquake that shook the foundations of the prison. Doors opened, chains fell off, and freedom was released. No prayer of complaint could have produced such a sudden deliverance, but their songs of gratitude carried power. Their miracle was born from thanksgiving in a place of suffering. Thanksgiving is also the key that turns battles into victories. When King Jehoshaphat faced overwhelming enemies, he appointed singers to give thanks to God ahead of the army. As they lifted their voices with gratitude, the Lord set ambushes against their enemies. The battle was won without swords, and the spoils were greater than expected. Thanksgiving birthed a miracle of supernatural victory that strategy alone could not achieve. Miracles manifest in the womb of thanksgiving because gratitude aligns the heart with God's nature. Gratitude declares God is faithful, powerful, and in control. That posture draws heaven into earthly situations. Thanksgiving silences fear and amplifies faith. It communicates readiness for God to act, and God honors that readiness with divine intervention. Thanksgiving is evidence of expectation, and expectation gives birth to miracles. A thankful heart magnifies God over the problem. When the problem seems bigger, faith weakens. But when God is magnified through gratitude, faith strengthens and miracles are conceived. Gratitude transforms an ordinary moment into a supernatural encounter. It takes what seems insignificant and positions it for divine touch. Just as a worm nurtures and develops life unseen until the appointed time, thanksgiving nurtures faith and prepares it until the miracle manifests in visible form. Thanksgiving is never wasted. It is a spiritual investment. Every time gratitude rises to God, it becomes a seed in the womb of the Spirit, and that seed must bring forth fruit. Gratitude may look simple, but it carries creative power. Miracles often come suddenly, but their conception point is thanksgiving. Whenever a person chooses to thank God sincerely and consistently, they are positioning themselves as carriers of divine surprises, breakthroughs, and testimonies that only heaven can explain.